only an expert can deal with the problem. Because half the problem is seeing the problem. And only an expert can deal with the problem. Only an expert can deal with the problem. So if there's no expert dealing with the problem, it's really actually twice the problem. Because only an expert can deal with the problem. Only an expert can deal with the problem.
I'm not 100% sure what Laurie Anderson's attitude towards experts are in that song, or is, or whatever. But yes, we're going to talk about the idea of expertise today. Expertise, is arguably constantly under threat in the United States, where populism seems to have a kind of an undertone or a subtext of opposing experts. What Richard Hofstadter referred to as anti-intellectualism. It's always been there, but it seems to be here on steroids right now. We'll talk about that as well. We'll, a little bit later in the show, talk about the way it functions, particularly in the medical sciences, where arguably the stakes are very, very high. Getting things right is very important. Getting things wrong, disastrous. And then at the end, on a maybe friendlier note, we'll have a conversation with our friend Adam Gopnik about his quest to master certain things that were kind of out of his expertise for most of his life. But we're going to begin with somebody we've talked to before, Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic, author of The Atlantic Daily Newsletter, and the author also of The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. He is also Professor Emeritus of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. Welcome back to the show, Tom Nichols.
Thanks, Colin.
Well, the category is expertise. Maybe we should just begin with an example. In the second Trump administration, various strands of anti-intellectualism we might have seen in the first Trump administration seem to be amplified. It seems to kind of surface, particularly in two ways: the people he hires and the people he fires. But let's talk about the people he fires for beginners. When Pete Hegseth was announced as Secretary of Defense, there were sort of two things that were said a lot. One of them was that he wasn't really, a high-ranking military officer, which was sort of the custom, or a custom, not the universal custom, but also he'd never run a huge organization. Administering a vast workforce is part of that job, which is why, yes, you can go from GM of General Motors, famously, to Secretary of Defense. But say a little bit about that, about the almost rejection of the idea that he needed certain credentials in order to meet a minimum standard.
Well, I think there's two problems with the way the Trump administration is approaching this. This populist idea of saying, well, ordinary folks, people that just say stuff on TV, they can run these things. That's an old idea, and in fact, you mentioned General Motors, which of course is when we go back to our friend Robert McNamara,
exactly,
becoming Secretary of Defense, and he was not a great one, but. Americans have this belief that if you're good at one thing, you're good at a bunch of things. But the second problem here is that I don't think that's really what the Trump administration's about. The Trump administration is on a kind of revenge tour. So they've put people like Pete Hegseth in specifically to kind of troll the public and to troll their opponents. Nobody really believes. I don't think Donald Trump really believes this. Nobody believes that Pete Hegseth is qualified to be Secretary of Defense. The Republicans who voted for him are scared to death of their own constituents who want this to be like a reality show, and they want good TV, and they figure Hegseth will give them good TV. I think that's a deeper problem here, that it's not some well-intentioned notion that, hey, we should give ordinary people a shot at running things. It's worse than that. It's for example, at the Justice Department. Oh, you didn't like Ed Martin? This kind of kooky conspiracy theorist? Good. I'll fix you. I'll give you Jeannie Pirro as the DC district attorney. I mean, it's not just anti-intellectualism. It's not anti-expertise. It's a kind of straight up hostility to actually governing and running things in any comprehensive or coherent way.
So rhetorically, one of the things that he contrasts, I think, implicitly with expertise is a two-word phrase he relies on very, very heavily, particularly in 2025. Let's hear a little montage of President Trump using this phrase. Here we go.
Over the past 6 weeks, I have signed nearly 100 executive orders and taken more than 400 executive actions, a record, to restore common sense, safety, optimism, and wealth all across our wonderful land. Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't. But in everything we do, we're putting America first because the Republican Party is now known as the party of common sense. It's a party of common sense, very important. I think it's a very important phrase for you to use. It's all about common sense. What the world has witnessed in the past 72 hours is nothing less than a revolution of common sense.
So let's talk about that, Tom. I hear in that an implicit repudiation of expertise. You don't need all this fancy book learning if you have common sense.
Right. The problem is when people like Donald Trump say common sense, what they really mean is stuff that I happen to think. In the book, I use an example of how common sense is really valuable. For example, an expert can tell you that if you drive really fast in the rain on wet leaves, that there is a formula, mathematical formula for, sort of how fast you'll go versus how deep your tire treads are and how far your wheelbase is before you'll start to slide. And you can work this out as an expert calculation. You don't really need that. Most people's common sense will tell you don't drive really fast in the rain on wet leaves because you've had some experience with this. You've seen bad things happen. Let us never devalue common sense because it's what keeps us out of trouble. Most of the times during the day, where we could have done something that would have where we would have hurt ourselves, common sense is what keeps us out of it. The problem is that when people like Trump use common sense, they don't only mean what I happen to think, they mean what I happen to want and what I want to believe is true. And that's not really common sense. That is simply saying, I don't like the expert conclusion, and my gut feeling is that I'd rather do something differently. And this gets to why people reject expertise, Colin, because it is exclusive. People think of it as elitist. And when it conflicts with what they want at some intuitive level, they want to reject it. I'll just use a personal example here. When I had to have an emergency appendectomy some 30 years ago, I started to get really scared. I mean, and this doctor said, look, this is really, we've got to get that out of there before, your appendix bursts and you die. And I said, I remember saying something like, are you sure? Because I didn't want to go through emergency surgery. I was surrounded by all these people. I was scared out of my mind. And here I am saying to this doctor who's trying to save my life, listen, you sure about this? Because that's normal. That's the normal human thing. And the doctor just kind of all these doctors kind of nodded and said, no, Mr. Nichols, we're pretty sure we know what we're doing. But when people talk about common sense, what they're really saying is, look, I don't know why I don't like this, or I don't know why I want this other thing. And I don't want some pointy head telling me otherwise. Just do the thing I want. And that's very much the way Trump uses it.
Yeah, and this isn't new to his second term. In his first term, sometimes it would be almost like agitprop. I remember in 2019 with Hurricane Dorian bearing down, and Trump somehow had just decided it was going to hit Alabama. And his way of dealing with that was to take, as you recall, Tom, a Sharpie and draw a new path for the storm on some NOAA map. It was kind of like, yes, all those climate scientists and meteorologists, they may think they know where this hurricane is going, but I'm the one with the Sharpie right now, so I guess I'm the boss of you. Go ahead.
Trump is very childlike about this. So when he uses expressions like common sense, I mean, it really is, sort of the way small children use it. Well, I think the storm's going to go over here because that's where I want it to go. And this is, the problem for people like Trump is that experts are the people who, without partisanship, without rancor, without favor, simply say, look, the thing you want isn't going to happen. Or the thing you're going to try and do could be extremely dangerous. No, trade wars are not easy to win, sir. Tariffs are generally a bad idea. And, that's when people say, yes, but you're now, by arguing with me about that, you're looking down on me. You're telling me that I'm stupid. And I think that's been a big change in American culture. that people, when they hear experts tell them something, they don't hear that they're getting advice or information. They're narcissistic. This kind of deeply narcissistic reaction bubbles up that says, "You're talking down to me. You're looking down on me."
The other thing that we've seen that has been interesting is the occasional realization that, because Doge has come in particular, and a whole bunch of tech bros in their 20s who don't have a lot of expertise in whatever department they are currently doing massive surgery on, come in. But I've started to refer to this as the Control Z era, because frequently they fire people who, either the court restores the job, but also in some cases, and you're aware of some of these cases, especially with the National Nuclear Safety Administration, they just fire people who have expertise that's irreplaceable and needed. And so you have to do a Control Z. You have to hire these people back, which is obviously chaotic, but at least we're having this kind of belated recognition that some people have irreplaceable levels of knowledge.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I'm going to steal that from you, Colin. I like the Control Z era.
I was so proud of it. Now it's going to become a Tom Nichols trope. All right.
I will give, as a former scholar, I will give proper attribution. Okay. But the problem here again, well, first of all, the problem with Elon Musk is that embedded belief that if you have gazillion billion dollars, you must be smart. And not only smart, but smart at everything. That this is a uniquely, I think, I shouldn't say uniquely, but heavily American conceit that if you're super rich, you must be just really smart about everything. And the people who believe this most strongly are really rich people who feel, that they can opine about everything from, the Ukraine war to space travel. But the other problem is, again, this kind of magnificent narcissism where you have these kids walking in and saying, well, until 2 weeks ago, I didn't know there was such a thing as the National Nuclear Safety Administration. I don't understand your job. And if I don't understand it, nobody possibly could. And therefore, it can be eliminated. And it tells you something about the change in our culture, that we would just unleash a bunch of kids basically with no background in anything who said, well, their primary qualification is they said, well, I was good at going to school. I had some good grades and I went to a good college. We make this mistake over and over again, that expertise is not just about credentials. It's about experience, judgment, a history of performance and so on. But it is just remarkable that we fired people simply because some tech bros said, I don't really understand any of this. And so therefore, if I can't understand it, who possibly could?
So as you say, the culture has changed, but also it hasn't changed. And this is something that you can sketch out better than I can. But I think about 1952, where, Stevenson versus Eisenhower, it seemed as though even in that election, that the fact that Stevenson was really smarted, really articulate, and could think on his feet, and could use, kind of highfalutin words every once in a while, that really it counted as a mark against him. And you take that into the 1960s. You used the term pointy-headed a couple of seconds ago. I believe George Wallace is the one who kind of popularized that term, pointy-headed college professors. But at the same time, you've got Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman saying, don't trust anybody over 30, which is essentially saying people who have lived longer than that have acquired a lot of cynical knowledge that's of no use to us, very spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment hippies. We've been living with this kind of thinking, I think, for a long time. I guess we've never seen it, actualized.
But what's different?
Yeah.
But what's different? You're right about, Stevenson. Of course, Stevenson also came across as kind of a, icy customer. Americans do like to be catered to. They like to be pandered to. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, and he still went out there and did that, shucks, lip biting, good old boy stuff. Jimmy Carter was a Naval Academy graduate who knew about nuclear stuff and, didn't really play that part when he was campaigning. So to some extent, this is a normal thing. What's different is that people now say, not only do I distrust these intellectuals, I know better than they do. Let me tell you how to solve the war in Ukraine. rather than saying, look, I'm a Republican, I want my guys to solve the Ukraine problem, or I'm a Democrat, I want my experts, my diplomats to solve this problem. You have people saying, hey, why don't you send that friend of the president who's a real estate guy? And you're seeing the result of that. Witkoff gets to Moscow. He's in over his head instantly, has no idea what's going on, gets outplayed. Someone pointed out that around the table in his first meeting in Moscow, there was something like an accumulated 150 years of diplomatic experience around the table, as opposed to Witkoff's, 90 days. And that's the thing that's different. It's people have never liked intellectuals and college professors. I was a college professor for a long time. I have heard all the jokes and all the zingers. But what's different now is saying not just that I don't trust you or I would rather have my guys. It's I know better than you. Doctors get this all the time. You have your diagnosis and I have mine.
Right. I did my own research.
I think you should do.
Yeah. So, the living embodiment, I think, during this era has been Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan having for most of this time the most listened to podcast and a tremendous amount of influence. And that's who he is. He's a guy who doesn't prepare for his interviews. If things come up during the show, he has one of his Confederates Google it in real time while having conversations about complex medical issues. There's a famous clip of him just unloading on a woman who calls in. She's an actress. She's a primatologist, and she's disputing something that he's saying. The thing he's saying, oh, by the way, is totally incorrect. And he's just screaming at her. And at one point he says, he basically tells her that she stopped learning anything when she got her PhD, while he has continued to read on the internet. He uses that term. But I do think that he's in this kind of everyman figure taking on these experts. He's kind of the embodiment of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And that Rush Limbaugh blazed some of that path earlier, but Rogan has really turned it into an art form. And most interesting is that Rogan, when pushed about this, as you recently saw, there was he had an interaction with somebody talking about the Middle East, retreats to what a lot of these folks do when pressed. Well, I'm just asking questions. I'm not really an expert. I'm just an intelligent guy who asks stuff. And this is, again, think about the gigantic amount of narcissism it takes to tell someone with a PhD, you've stopped learning. I'm the guy that's still learning stuff. And I think part of that happens because we live in a very advanced age with a very high standard of living, with a lot of very convenient technology that makes everything around us look easy. How hard can it be to figure this out? I have the internet, I have, YouTube, I can reach out to anybody in the world. I mean, I've had grade school kids say, I'd like to interview you about Cold War history, like when I was at the War College. I'm like, okay, I'm happy to answer your questions, but you might want to start with a book.
Yeah.
And this is really endemic to our culture now, is that we can take all these shortcuts that feel like erudition but aren't.
So the other part of this is that experts are wrong. Part of being an expert, scientists will tell you, part of being a scientist is you get things wrong and you figure out that they're wrong, and then you try to fix them, and you keep learning and you keep pushing. That has helped, I think, for some people undermine their confidence in experts. I'm just sort of wondering, as we near the end of this conversation, whether there's anything that you can say almost as a heuristic about how to decide whom to trust, how to decide how to evaluate information in a confusing environment.
Well, one thing I would say to folks listening is, yes, experts get things wrong, and sometimes they get them disastrously wrong. But this is also the plane crash fallacy, right? That when a plane crashes, it's incredible, it's spectacular. And no matter how many times you tell people that flying is simply the safest way to travel, they just don't believe you, because they're looking at all that fiery wreckage and saying, yeah, well, that pilot, you can say what you want, but this airplane, that pilot, clearly you're wrong. So the first thing is people should think about all the things that go right. Yes, for example, we have drug trials that have gone wrong, but the average American, we have hundreds of thousands of over-the-counter medications that didn't even exist 30 years ago, and that Americans take without even thinking about it and the safety of it. The big failures that I think people concentrate on are when politics and expertise commingle. You know, the one that always gets thrown up at that moment is the Gulf War, where you had, you know, experts saying, well, there's WMD. Well, you had political leaders also wanting to do this, and the public, which supported the Gulf War, wanting to do this. But 9 times out of 10, when you're talking about expert failures, you're really talking about, at least in politics, you're talking about the result of a process where experts were simply one party to it. I used to advise a U.S. senator when I spent a year on the Hill advising a U.S. senator on foreign and defense affairs. And my advice wasn't always great, but it was better than the average bear. The other thing I would tell people is to think about what the alternative to expertise. And the example I always use is that cringing scene in Castaway. Remember the Tom Hanks movie where he's got a toothache, right? And he's got an abscess and he has to literally take out his own tooth with a skate. And I can't even watch that scene. It's so painful. But, you know, you ask people, would you rather have the dumbest dentist in the world who still nonetheless has a license to practice dentistry, or would you rather try this yourself? And that's suddenly when you will appreciate the value of expertise, because even the least qualified experts are probably better at whatever it is than you are. And this is the heuristic. You asked for a heuristic. I always say, look, experts can get things wrong, but they are less likely to be wrong than you are.
That's a very good heuristic. I couldn't be happier. Tom Nichols, it's always a joy to talk to you and your expertise. Staff writer at The Atlantic, author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter, author of The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge, and Why It Matters, and also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. That's its own kind of expertise. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back with Alan Dove to talk about the medical science end of this.
Required the grace and not the brute. For if you asleep, you nick the skin, you clip the chin, you rip the lip a bit, and that's the truth. To shave the face, or even a part, without it a smart, require the heart. Take the art, I show you a chart, I study a starting in my youth. To cut the hair, to trim the beard, to make the bristle clean like a whistle. This is from early infancy, the talent given to me by God.
So when as some of you know, back in 2020 and 2021, essentially the two people closest to me received terrifying and very complex medical diagnoses. And at the time, a friend of mine, Greg, said to me, you know, you've kind of gotten through your life trying to be the smartest person in the world, just, you know, or the smartest person in the room or something. He said, and that's not going to work this time. You don't know enough about this to be the expert. And you are going to have to trust people. You're going to have to trust the physicians. You get the best physicians you can find caring for these people that you love. It was such great advice. People tend not to follow it. Alan Dove is here, science journalist and co-host of the podcast This Week in Virology. He has a PhD in microbiology from Columbia University. He's been on the show before, and I also listened to that podcast. And so, Alan, what I just described and that really great advice I got is sort of at odds with how people behave these days. People kind of assume they can, as the phrase goes, do their own research, often about complex biomedical questions.
Yes, absolutely. And I think at the start of the show, Tom really kind of framed this very nicely, that people, part of the problem is that people don't like hearing things that they don't want to believe. You know, you have appendicitis. Well, that is terrible news. I don't want that to be true. Or there's a virus circulating and you can't go to Thanksgiving dinner now. No, I don't want that to be true. And at the same time, we're living in an environment where you can do a Google search on something and find any answer you want. And when I say that, I mean not just any correct answer, I mean any type of answer you want. You can find out that something is true. You can find out the same thing is false. And because of the way that algorithm works, the further you search on the topic, the more it will cater to what you want to see. Because remember, Google is not a library, they're an advertiser. So the idea is to keep you searching and drilling down into your own little rabbit hole. And yes, this is something that in medicine has the possibly worst personal stakes that you could. My wife is a doctor, and we often talk about this because it's something she sees on a daily basis. And she traces it. I agree with her about 90% on this. She feels that 100% of the problem is the 1997 decision of the FDA to deregulate direct-to-consumer drug advertising. I think that's a significant chunk of the problem, but I think that the rise of Google and social media have poured gasoline on that.
Yeah, we should say that direct-to-consumer advertising. I think New Zealand is the only other place that does it. And it so often ends with ask your physician if Flomax is right for you. Ask your physician. They're sort of charging you to go charging into your physician's office and ask about that. I'm a big fan of This Week in Virology, and particularly I enjoy not only the stuff that you guys do, but on the weekends, Daniel Griffin, who's a just tremendous physician, works with Vincent Racaniello, the virologist who kind of founded this whole thing. And they often lately, because you guys try to keep it scientific and not political, but it's been hard lately. And Vincent, it's fun to listen to him get mad because he gets mad very colorfully. But I mean, it's almost like a weekly occurrence now that he just talks about the fact that someone is making really big decisions about how medical care is going to be delivered or about how preventative care is going to be structured, and that person doesn't have any qualifications. And it's got to be difficult for you guys to see that happen. I mean, everybody who's involved with that project has essentially spent their lives getting good at something and having it sort of not matter a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And this, going back to when the pandemic was first erupting in early 2020, somebody on the platform that was then known as Twitter commented, if you're asking who could have foreseen this coming, the answer is everybody who studies infectious disease. So the expertise is there, and the experts right now are sitting around looking at the decisions being made and saying, my God, this is a tragedy unfolding. Because not only are people who have no clue being put in charge of tremendously important agencies like Health and Human Services, that impacts every American's life, whether they realize it or not. And it's not just that these folks don't know what they're doing, it's that they are actively disinterested in figuring out what they're doing or understanding any of the context of their actions and doing things on a massive scale. So yes, it's been an absolute horror show, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's fun to watch Vincent get animated as he gesticulates now that we're on Zoom, doing video for our shows. But the reality of it is really it's a dark time for medical science.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting. I mean, you can sort of use some specific cases. There's a new vaccine approval process being instituted that goes around the old process of FDA approval that included an external advisory committee of experts. It's called VRBPAC, VRBPAC. There's another panel that the CDC uses called ACIP. These are panels of experts who look at the important questions around vaccines. And, at a time when, a larger and larger cohort of people are nervous or skeptical about vaccines. And the way of dealing with this appears to have been to take away the input of the people who could make meaningful input. I mean, it's almost hard to wrap your mind around it.
And it's not really just a question of, these are the authorities, we should listen to the authorities. I don't like that view of expertise, that we should obey experts because they're experts. We should listen to experts because they've spent, in many cases, lifetimes studying this issue, and they, as a result, appreciate the full complexity of it. So if you've ever, read or followed ACIP, which I have fairly closely in various approvals that they've done, they do not just sit around at tables and say, yeah, I think we ought to approve this one, or I think we ought to disapprove this one. There are thousands and thousands of pages of documents and many, many hours of meetings and conference calls that go into this, where people get into the minutiae that you have to be an expert to understand. You're not going to be able to Google this in an afternoon or even a year in order to really appreciate how to analyze the immense quantity of data that goes into a vaccine approval. And to just cast all that aside and, I guess, go with some kind of a gut feeling, we're going to end up with really bad outcomes.
I think, one of the paradoxes is that people, on the one hand, often perceive scientific consensus or biomedical consensus as monolithic. And they also are aware that sometimes scientific consensus is wrong. But behind both of those things is this process of dialogue that you're kind of hinting at with your last answer. I mean, I listen to you guys. Paul Offit, who knows about as much about vaccines as anybody, can come on your show and have a pretty big disagreement with one of the other panelists. It's not monolithic, and part of the process is kind of arguing in a pleasant, constructive way until you get closer to the truth.
And that's something we try to, for me, it's the appeal of the show, is those conversations that we have as scientists, and being able to share those with people and show how the process really works. It's not one person comes forward and hands down truth with a capital T. It is very much an interactive, iterative process. And yes, it is often wrong, but one of the hallmarks, I think, of, well, certainly of scientific expertise, I think of expertise in general, is an open acknowledgement of limitations of your own expertise. So, if you are talking to an expert, if you go in and you're talking to your doctor about some strange pain that you're experiencing, if you have a good doctor, they even a mediocre doctor, they'll generally say, well, in my experience, somebody with your medical history, it's probably this, but we can't really tell without doing some tests, and even the tests may not be definitive. They will acknowledge the boundaries of their expertise. And I think that's really critical. And I think it's important for people to appreciate, yes, experts can be wrong, but somebody who is actually an expert is more likely to quantify their wrongness up front and let you know how much confidence you should have in their answer.
Yeah, I think also one of the paradoxes of the current environment, and one of the real conundrums, is because it's a very heated and at times antagonistic environment, the process of discovering, I'll give an example. Okay, so early in the pandemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci comes out and says, look, it's probably not aerosolized. And here's why I don't think it's aerosolized. It's not airborne. It's probably droplet transmitted. And then at a certain point, because they were building the bridge and trying to walk across it at the same time, they discovered that was not the case, and that it was airborne, it was aerosolized. But then if you go back to that same skeptical audience and you say, you know what, we were wrong. I said something at a national press conference that it just turns out was our best understanding at this point, but it's not true. Now we know something that's much more obviously true. I mean, that's a problem too. That can be taken as a kind of a sign of weakness of expertise.
And that, I think, is a product of the way the modern internet works and has been consolidated in the hands of very few corporations, which are all built on a social media /advertising model. So that really what sells online is definitive short answers. The classic example being Google the error message, okay, which is a great way to solve 99% of computer problems, by the way, and my daughter will say, oh, this happened. Did you Google the error message? And if you're dealing with something like a computer problem, that is very effective because it probably is something that's going to have a definitive solution, and somebody will have stated it and you can test it right there. When you apply that to medicine or vaccine approval or international relations or any other large complex problem, the internet will spit out a definitive solution for you and say, vaccines cause whatever. And it's got that truthiness to it, right? It seems like, oh yeah, that could be, if you don't know what you're talking about. And people love that quick shot of feeling like they know the answer and they can somehow do something about it. And that's the trap.
Alan, so much of the conversation that we're having right now points to the importance of the work that you guys are doing. Keep doing it. I wish more people listened to This Week in Virology. Some of the stuff during the weekdays is a little over my head, but certainly the clinical update with Daniel Griffin, everybody can understand. Alan Dove doing great work as a science journalist and co-host of the podcast This Week in Virology. We'll take a little break and we will come back and we will talk to somebody, an old friend of the show, who has been exploring the question of mastery. Okay, first of all, a quick correction from earlier in the show. Tom Nichols is no longer involved in the daily newsletter from The Atlantic. He does all the other things he's still a 5-time Jeopardy champion and many other things as well. Today's show, the technical producer is the maestro, Dylan Reyes, and this is a production of Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions, and we thank Lily Tyson for doing it. All right, so our final segment here. People have asked me why Adam Gopnik hasn't been on the show for a while, because he used to be on, fairly often anyway. And I have to admit there's some bitterness and small-mindedness on my part. I read for the role of Adam Gopnik in the movie Tar, and I was actually called back for a second audition, and I really thought I had it. I mean, my agent thought I had it. And then suddenly I get this call saying, no, Adam Gopnik is going to play Adam Gopnik in Tar. And he has a kind of mastery of this, of being Adam Gopnik. He's just so good at it, you couldn't really hope to exceed that. And so, I don't know, Adam, that was very disappointing for me, but staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of, relevantly right now, The Real Work on the Mystery of Mastery is with us. Welcome back. I'm going to put this whole ugly episode aside, Adam, and renew our friendship.
It's heartbreaking. As a man of the theater, I know how hard it is when you get the call back and you don't get the final call back. And what can I say? I was miscast, but they thought it brought a certain kind of panache to it to have somebody that all for it. I'll tell you the whole story about how that happened someday. But anyway, breaks my heart.
All right. So your book is about what happens when you decide to build up your skills, maybe kind of achieve a kind of mastery at things that might have eluded you or been deficits or just stuff that you love. So you work with a drawing instructor, you study magic, you learn to drive, you ask your mother to teach you bread making, you see a therapist to treat your phobia of urinating in public bathrooms, and then you take boxing lessons and ballroom dancing lessons. So that's a lot. And it's kind of not, my sense in reading the book, I really love this book. It's just so generous and warm. This is really a book more about how you like to spend time with people who are good at things that you would kind of like to be good at. That's sort of my sense of it anyway.
Malcolm Gladwell, good friend, said to me about it on stage, actually, this is really a book about you falling in love with teachers. And that's true. In fact, the original first line of the book, Colin, was, this is a self-help book that won't help. And my publisher asked me to defer that to a little later in the introduction. But yes, I make no pretenses to having, being able to give people a recipe for how to get good at things. What I can say is that I think we all remain curious about things outside ourselves and things outside our usual realm of expertise. And it's incomparably rewarding to continue to pursue those things, however ham-handedly, however incompetently even, as you go on. I've just come back from boxing. Actually, I have to go all the way an hour out to Brooklyn from Manhattan just to box. You do not want to put me in a ring, Colin, with another fighter, unless you can find another 60-something, 5'5" Jewish intellectual who's ready to do it. And yet, the cognitive discipline, the mental serenity, the physical equipoise I find from boxing with my daughter, as it happens, is incomparable. And that's sort of the lesson of the book. It's that we make for ourselves in that phenomenon that psychologists sometimes call the flow, this incredibly powerful opiate. It's the only one we can inject directly from our own brains into our own veins. And doing that, I find to be endlessly rejuvenating in every sense.
Reading the book too, I find myself thinking of one of my favorite lines from the movie Chariots of Fire, where the trainer, Sam Mussabini, says to the sprinter Abrams, "What God left out, I cannot put in." And,
Yes.
and then he says, "But if you've got that extra tenth of a second left in you somewhere, Mr. Abrams, I will find it." But there's some truth to that too, right? I mean, boxing is a really great example. You could lift weights forever and not be able to punch as hard as Sugar Ray Leonard because there's some inexplicable symphony of muscle contractions and neural coordinates. You could get your arm really strong and not be able to throw in from right field the way Dwight Evans did in his prime. Some of this is just stuff we're not going to get to, right?
Absolutely. I love hearing Dwight Evans' name recited. It's been a while. Absolutely. I think you can believe with complete ease that there is such a thing as natural gifts because we've all encountered it countless times in our lives. It'd be ridiculous to impugn that concept. But at the same time, you recognize two things, I think, Colin. One is that whether you have the natural gift or not, it is astonishing how much better you can get at anything just through the practice of passionate perseverance. And that's hugely cheering. Yeah, and you're not trying to get to the concert level when you play piano or race car level when belatedly, as I did, you learn to drive. You're trying to discover the pleasure of that competence. And the pleasure of having a competence is enormous. The other thing is you get insight into the things you do well, because what you recognize is, in a way that's very humbling, that everything we do, the thing I do well is right. And I've been doing it since I was 6 years old. But the truth is, I do it better, I think, all the time because I practice it all the time. I write for 6 hours a day. I'm always here at my desk with my books around me. And as I say, there's something deeply humbling and also, in the deepest sense, instructive about discovering that everything in the world is simply a business of breaking down a complicated activity into its small component parts, practicing those component parts in the most stumbling and awkward possible way until somehow miraculously they come together as what seems, at least, to be a seamless sequence, seamless in the other sense. And that's as close to a universal rule of mastery, of expertise, if you like, as you can hope to find.
I do want to say the one time I tried to box against a real boxer, by the second minute of the 3-minute round, he was literally chasing me around the ring, everything that I had thought about it just completely fallen apart. But another thing that intrigued me about all this, so there sort of can't be any polymaths anymore the way Christopher Wren was a polymath, right? You can't be an architect and an astronomer and a physicist and a master, all those things. It's just there's too much of it. But I feel like people in your business and people in my business, we run the risk of not exactly being polymaths, but I always tell people I'm about a half inch deep on just about everything, but I don't really know a lot about anything. And I feel that a little here in you. I mean, I'm wearing a hat that says "We Digress." I love how digressive this book is. And I just have to say for people listening, Adam can be in the middle of writing about magicians and suddenly do 2 or 3 pages about medieval Persian poetry. And it completely makes sense. But, it's sort of antithetical to the monofocus that a magician has to get really good.
Sure. And, I'm cursed or blessed with a horizontal mind, what the Buddhists call a monkey mind, leaps from branch to branch rather than staying implanted vertically. And it's what God gave me. But I won't apologize for it entirely because I think that there's juice to be squeezed from pursuing that sort of thing. The whole point about talking about Persian poetry was talking about problem of intention, right? How do you judge anything, a magic trick or a poem, if you don't know what the original intention was? I think that I wouldn't claim polymath for myself. But one thing I would say is, when you talk about, and people often talk about Renaissance men, Leonardo being the greatest, right? Or Alberti or so on. What's fascinating when you actually study those guys or women is not their breadth of expertise, it's their intensity of commitment. They weren't necessarily good at all of those things. We've outdone them in some ways. Leonardo had totally fakakta ideas about how to paint frescoes, but the intensity of commitment was absolute. And that's still available, I think, to all of us.
I think one of the other things that you explore in a wonderful way is kind of where we fit into these continuums of expertise. You know, there's things that we love that we can't necessarily be great at. There's a sentence in your book. It just hit me in the face because you really could have written it about me. I think my technical producer Dylan will enjoy this. You talk about how you learned something. You learned something about yourself that you were not, quote, someone highly skilled in music who can't get its meanings, but someone so overwhelmed by the meanings of music as to make him look past the fact that he has no particular skill at it. That's exactly me too. And I another great line from the book is there can't be magic without a mark. Somebody has to be the audience for everything. Somebody has to be the connoisseur who loves the thing. But I mean, I have a primary care ceramicist who makes little coasters for the table in the show and stuff. I'm just the audience. And sometimes you have to realize that, right? That you're the audience.
Yes, and it's like that great Chris Rock line about relationships. Sometimes you're singing lead and sometimes you're on tambourine. Absolutely. But let me just add, because that's sort of the final conclusion, if you like, of this book, is that we only do our work, whether it's work that we do as a vocation or work we do as a secondary passion, in the presence of an audience. Expertise, mastery makes no sense except in the presence of another. Every boxing blow that you're taught by a great boxing coach is in response to some imaginary other boxer. You're learning to dance, you dance with another person. All the things we create, even if sometimes only in the imaginary shadow of some other. And that, more than anything else, the way in which we become communal people by improving our solitary excellence, that's meant to be the moral of the book.
Boy, I would like to talk to you for many more minutes about this, but we're essentially out of time for this. But I do want to say, I think this book is wonderful. It really kind of gets at a lot of things that I've been thinking about, but a lot less coherently than the way that you've done it. So first of all, it's great to have you back on the show. I think for both of us, life is this continuing education process. And that's what makes it exciting, right? That every day you can learn another thing.
Thank you. And yes, and the one thing I would add to any question and discussion of expertise is education is an absolute good. It should be as universal as we can possibly make it, but never listen to people who deprecate education as an elitist activity. Education is the ultimate activity of the humanities in the broadest sense.
Yeah, goes back to something that was said in the Tom Nichols part earlier in the show. The book is called The Real Work. We should have said that that's a magician's term. You're going to have to read the book to find out what it means. The Real Work, on the Mystery of Mastery by Adam Gopnik. He'll be back for our Polymath show. We're also going to do an episode that's just the biography of one song. It's going to be the song I Won't Dance. I think Adam is going to be perfect for that. We're going to keep Adam very busy in the coming year or so. But thanks to everybody who listened to today's show, and we'll be back with more tomorrow. We're going to talk about Alcatraz tomorrow.